My name is Brigitte Unge, and I'm Professor of Public Sector at Utrecht University School of Economics. The idea for this special issue on taxation as regulatory governance was born during our 3 years EU Horizon 2020 project COFFERS, Combating Fiscal Fraud and Empowering Regulators, of which I was the leader. We have been a multidisciplinary group of scholars who were all concerned about the international tax system, which had produced large amounts of inequality through tax avoidance, which is the legal way of not paying taxes, tax evasion, which is the illegal way of not paying taxes, and money laundering, which is the criminal way of using the tax system. New international tax reforms gave hope that loopholes between national tax regulation, which allowed tax avoidance of estimated 680 billion euros annually, might be closed, and that transparency and information exchange between countries might improve. We studied the tax system as an ecosystem in which governments, corporations, tax experts will react to international tax reforms by trying to restructure and survive, like the species of an ecosystem after a volcano, and will look for new niches of survival. For this special issue of regulation and governance, we take a regulatory governance perspective on taxation, which goes beyond the traditional perspective of taxation as being distinct from regulation. Regulation and taxation literature rarely met. They should, as we hope to show. Taxation has always been used to somehow influence citizens' behavior, from the Babylonian divorce tax of 2350 before Christ to taxes on gambling and prostitution, or to more modern Pigovian taxes on pollution. Though with this, taxes always regulated behavior, taxation was seen as the economically friendlier instrument to steer behavior through voluntary choices, through taxes, through money, as opposed to regulation, which forbids sanctions and is stricter. But as we show in this special issue, taxation can be interpreted as regulation. This is especially true when it comes to international taxation. We analyzed in this special issue the historic development of the international tax system, the amounts of tax money involved, tools and methods how to identify tax havens, and the effects of the new international tax reforms, such as automatic exchange of information, where banks have to report accounts held by foreigners, or country by country reporting, where companies have to report their profits separately in each country to avoid profit shifting to tax haven. I give the floor now to Thomas Rixen, with whom I edited this special issue.
Yes, thanks, Brigitte. And to pick up where Brigitte just left, basically what we do in this special issue and what Brigitte and I set out in the introduction and in the introductory article is that we argue that regulation and taxation are really very similar in many respects, and that taxation can be seen as a form of regulation, as Brigitte has just told you. And moreover, and this is an empirical claim that we make in this introduction, is that over the last 3 decades, we have seen very similar trends in taxation as we have seen in other regulatory fields. And more to the point, we make out 3 shifts of governance that we see in regulation more generally, but that are also very characteristic of the tax area. And these 3 shifts, as you can see here on the slide, are first that we see a trend from national regulation to international, and more precisely to multi-level governance, meaning that regulations are not purely carried out and made at the national level, but that we also have global and regional levels of regulation and governance, and that moreover these different levels interact with each other. And we have a number of papers that speak to this shift, as you'll see in a minute. But before we get to that, let me tell you what the other 2 shifts are about. The second is that traditionally tax governance has been direct governance, and moreover, it's basically been governance by public agents that interact with taxpayers. Taxpayers, of course, have always been private agents, but the governance itself was carried out by public agents. What we increasingly see in the new tax governance is that private actors play an important role in the governance of taxation. And here you can think, for example, of the Big Four. One paper deals with their influence a lot, for example. So this is the second shift of governance, a move from the direct interaction of public authorities with taxpayers to an interaction that is intermediated increasingly by private actors. Third shift of governance is from hierarchical and coercive governance, which is the characteristic way to think about taxes. There is basically an authority that is at the top and taxpayers are at the bottom. And the implementation of tax law is done in a hierarchical way and backed by threats of sanctions and coercion. Increasingly, and this is of course, as many scholars of regulation will know, in line with developments in the field of regulation more generally, authorities increasingly rely on cooperative modes of regulation and often resort to measures that are responsive to the needs of those regulated or of those, in our case, paying taxes. And as you will see in a minute, we also have a number of papers that deal with this shift. So now for the purposes of this video, to introduce our special issue to you, we have invited the authors of the papers that make up the special issue to answer 3 questions on their paper. And these 3 questions are the following. First, what is your paper about? Second, what is your main finding? And third, why is it important for regulation and governance scholarship? And what we'd like to do in the next couple of minutes is to go around the table and have each author or one of the authors of, because some of the papers are co-authored, reply to these questions so that you get a good overview of what you can expect if you read the articles in this special issue. We'll start with Sol Picciotto. Sol, of course, is like something of a founding father of our little discipline here, of international taxation in a more social science way. He is a lawyer by training, but very early on took a much broader perspective on international tax issues. And I think actually the paper of his title speaks to kind of this perspective. So Sol, please.
Thank you, Thomas and Brigitte. I was privileged to be both on the academic advisory group of COFAs, but also at the same time involved directly in the policy debate. So my paper focuses on the interaction between politics and the technocratic sphere through which policies are developed. So I argue that although a regime like international tax has been given stability, the international tax regime has been stable for about 100 years, it's been given stability essentially through depoliticization as a technocratic sphere, but still its nature and application is dominated by both the political power of governments, but also, quite importantly, the economic power essentially of the large transnational corporations whose activities it regulates, if you like, mainly because they command the resources to dominate the discourses and practices of the technical sphere. So the paper sketches out this historical development from the origins in the 1920s, but focuses particularly on 3 periods, if you like, of repoliticization, because I argue that the stability given by the authority of the technocratic specialists has been led to repoliticization in periods of crisis. And first, this occurred in the 1970s with the big debates about the power of multinationals. Again, in the 1990s, from 1996 to 98, with the emergence really of extensive problems of tax evasion by wealthy people and avoidance by the large transnational corporations. But in both of those episodes, there was a process of what I argue is a transnational technicization. And the regime became institutionally technicized, focusing on the OECD. The OECD provided an institutional framework, if you like, for its increasing transnational technicization. But then the great financial crash, but particularly the austerity and the tax problems ensuing, caused the most recent process, probably a most profound repoliticization. And that's the period, obviously, that the Coffers Project was studying. And I focused particularly on the attempts to reform corporate taxation. I mean, in that period, there was an early, quite quick gain, if you like, with a big paradigm shift in the area of exchange of information on bank accounts. And that was facilitated by the new US administration, the Obama administration coming in. But in that area, there's still a lot to be done, particularly in terms of developing beneficial ownership information. But I focus particularly on the deeply entrenched technical nature of international corporate taxation based on a rather rigid and inappropriate system of taxing multinationals, which I analyze, which really calls for a paradigm shift. But its high degree of technicization at the transnational level has made this quite resistant. So although there have been moves towards a shift towards a new paradigm, there's still deep contradictions in that process, which I trace to the increasing gap, if you like, between the political and technocratic spheres. At the time of writing, again, post the financial crisis, the political sphere itself was in great turbulence, where you had the rise of populism and the increasing difficulty of getting, if you like, coherence in the political sphere, with also skepticism of experts, while in the sphere of expertise or technocracy, at the same time, as I say, it's certainly in the international tax sphere, this was really quite disturbed and quite difficult for a new paradigm to emerge. So the last part of the paper looks at that gap, which I think has a more general relevance to other areas of regulation. Obviously, we've all been preoccupied by COVID, and I think there are some parallels there to the issue, although obviously very different. I could say more about its application to COVID, but no doubt other people are more expert on that. The issue in international tax is still fluid. The issue is still developing. Obviously, the relationship between the political and technocratic sphere has changed again, with somewhat restabilization in the political sphere, but we've yet to see what the outcome will be, particularly on international corporate taxation.
Thank you very much, Sol. And moving on actually to the next shift of governance, the precarious role of private intermediaries. And in that respect, the special issue has two papers. The first one by a team from Copenhagen Business School, Rasmus Christensen, Len Seabrook, and Duncan Wigan. They deal with professional action in global wealth chains. And unfortunately, none of the authors can be here today, but we are lucky to have Sheila Killian from a team of Limerick, and they have contributed a paper entitled Regulating Havens, the Role of Hard and Soft Governance of Tax Experts in Conditions of Secrecy and Low Regulation. Sheila, tell us what your paper is about. I think you need to unmute your...
Thank you, Thomas. So to answer the three questions, What are papers about? Tax experts are intermediaries between taxpayers and government, and so they are an important part of the ecosystem. They are in themselves taxpayers, but they function professionally in a different role. And they're governed in that professional work by a range of elements. Some are hard governance, like the law and penalties, and some are soft, like professional norms and firm ethos. And as Thomas noted earlier, there is a shift in the form of governance over tax more generally. Our paper looks at the network of hard and soft elements of governance and tests whether the influence of them is different in the kinds of problematic jurisdictions often called tax havens. And we break down tax havens into two aspects, loose regulation and secrecy. We find that both of those aspects impact on how relevant hard and soft governance elements are to tax experts. We find they have slightly different effects. Hard governance, things like regulation and sanctions, have the highest impact where regulations are tight, but they're not affected by secrecy. Soft governance, especially the ethos of the employing firm, is most influential where regulation is loose and where secrecy is high. And the professional body is most influential in those kind of secrecy locations too. So why does this matter? It matters because the impact of soft governance could be underestimated because it's a little intangible. But we find it be most impactful where other regulations are loose and where there's relatively little accountability. That means it matters more in sensitive conditions and offers a way of influencing an important group in the tax ecosystem. And documenting the interplay of hard and soft governance in this way broadens avenues for future research on the complex ways in which governance elements interact.
Thanks, Sheila. And then actually the next paper in line is one where I've been a co-author, and in our paper, we deal with new loopholes in the international tax system. And the paper starts with the observation that after we have seen the implementation of automatic sharing of tax information across borders through US laws, the Foreign Account Taxpayers Compliance Act and the OECD's Common Reporting Standard, which are both regulations that make automatic exchange of information on a comprehensive basis applicable. And there is nonetheless the possibility that those new rules can be circumvented by taxpayers to continue evading taxes. And therefore, in our paper, Leo Ahrens, Lukas Akelberg, and myself, we analyze whether and to what extent two different schemes that could be used to circumvent automatic information exchange are actually in use. And these two schemes that we focus on are golden visas, which are offers made by secrecy jurisdictions to give out citizenship or residency in their jurisdiction, so that automatic exchange of information basically runs empty, because the jurisdiction that receives the information does not have any interest in taxing the taxpayer. So that's the first scheme. And the second scheme works very similar for corporations. So-called corporate shells have the same effect, because asset ownership is then falsely attributed to a sham corporation in a tax haven or secrecy jurisdiction. So this is what we do. We look at are these things actually used, and we find only limited evidence for the use of these two schemes so far. So we can conclude that recent automatic exchange of information regulations are so far successful in the fight against tax evasion. However, we also find that over time, the use of these two schemes increases. And this suggests to us that taxpayers actually, while they adapt or may adapt slowly, they probably do adapt to these new regulations. And this leads us to conclude that regulators need to stay on their toes and adapt these regulations in the future. Why is this important for regulation and governance scholarship? Well, we argue that this is an important case of regulatory arbitrage, which is a topic that is studied by regulation scholars a lot. And there's a lot of theoretical treatment of regulatory arbitrage. However, empirical investigations of it are actually hard to do and therefore are pretty rare. And with our case study here, we provide such an empirical estimation for a very important and relevant case.
Okay, the next paper is on the development of the tax literature in economics and psychology from harsh punishment to responsive regulation. It is written by James Alm, Peter Gerbrands, and Eric Kirchler, and Professor Eric Kirchler, Professor of Psychology from the University of Vienna, will present it here. Eric, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Brigitte. Yeah, we focus on the responsive regulation. So James, Peter, and myself, we were collecting and discussing insights from behavioral sciences about how to improve compliance of individuals and firms in a very complex world, the world of taxation. We first start with the economics of crime approach, which focuses on a single individual that is driven by a single motivation, namely utility maximization. Now, this approach suggests a single regulation strategy that is expected to operate for all taxpayers in all situations. And despite its values, this approach has serious limitations. Therefore, we expand this perspective on various actors in the field. We look at the taxpayers, tax advisors, tax authorities, and especially tax auditors, and the government, and the interaction between these actors. And we think to understand tax behavior, it's important to understand the dynamics between these people, and also to consider that the population of taxpayers is quite heterogeneous with regard to the motives they have to cooperate. In a nutshell, what have we found? We think it is very important to consider the authority's power to enforce compliance in combination with its trustworthiness. And depending on a taxpayer's motivation to cooperate or not to cooperate, soft or harsh power strategies shall be applied. And depending on the trustworthiness of the government, the authorities in a nation state should either invest more in trust building in the country or develop their power strategies further. So there is a heterogeneous approach which has to be taken into consideration depending on whether people trust the government and the authorities or not. We simulate the various effects of expansions which we make, the expansions of the basic economic model in an agent-based model that is fully grounded in theory and calibrated for more than 30 European countries. And this simulation shows clearly the importance of a fully specified theoretical model. And this model goes well beyond the economics of crime approach. Why is our paper important for regulation and governance? Well, we think that our insights are important because we emphasize the importance of trust building and differential application of soft and harsh power strategies. So in essence, our insights are relevant because they show that a single one-fits-all strategy is not an effective strategy in an increasingly complex world with spreading use of artificial intelligence and digitalization in businesses and in the administration. So this heterogeneity needs to be considered, and different responses to different behavior need to be applied in a very flexible manner.
Thank you, Eric. Benchmarking can be seen as an important instrument to increase international transparency. Peter Jansky, Markus Mainzer, and Miroslav Palansky have written a contribution, Is Panama Really Your Tax Haven? secrecy jurisdictions and the countries they harm, and Miroslav Palansky will present it to us.
Thank you, Brigitte. So our paper deals with the political economy of secrecy jurisdictions. That is, countries that provide opportunities to foreigners to hide their real identity and to provide that opportunities for regulatory arbitrage in this area. Now, this lack of transparency in secrecy jurisdictions enables the existence of illicit financial flows, such as money laundering, tax evasion, and corruption. Now, in our paper, we quantify which secrecy jurisdictions supply the secrecy to which countries. We then use this framework to analyze how these jurisdictions resist international pressure to cooperate with the tax authorities of other countries. Our main finding is that more secretive jurisdictions indeed manage to keep more of the secrecy that they supply to other countries uncovered by policies such as automatic information exchange. In other words, secrecy jurisdictions are successful in keeping their business model in place for as long as possible, despite international pressure to cooperate. Overall, we shed more light on the power games in the arena of international tax and financial secrecy. Why is it important for regulation and governance scholarship? I believe our paper adds to the field's understanding of how secrecy jurisdictions respond to international pressure to cooperate, and how these jurisdictions strategically choose countries to cooperate with. And I think this is an important insight for policymakers and for international organizations that work on international cooperation policies. And our results highlight the importance of publishing detailed statistics on the information that is being exchanged. Now, this would allow researchers to assess the effectiveness of automatic information exchange in the fight against illicit financial flows.
Thank you, Miroslav. Lately, not paying taxes gets criminalized much harsher than before by making tax crimes a predicate crime for money laundering. One puts basically tax evaders in the same boat as drug dealers and terrorism financiers. But money laundering laws and tax laws must be implemented by each country. Lucia Russell, me, and Joris Verwede have written a paper on shedding light inside the black box of implementation, tax crime as a predicate crime for money laundering. And I give the floor to Lucia Russell, who will present it.
Hi, thanks, Brigitte. So our paper analyzes the fourth anti-money laundering directive that to punish tax crimes harshly, it incorporated taxes as a predicate crime for money laundering. We analyze how and why it has been implemented so differently across EU countries, both in the books and in action, and we do this through a novel data set. What do we find? So we find that country characteristics can explain formal transposition patterns and influence the domestic adaptation of regulation and how practitioners, what we call the second front line of implementation, use these rules in action and in practice. Aspects like corruption or government effectiveness, regulatory quality, tax morale, and tax administrative capacity are essential to explain these lingering differences in the books and in action among EU members. Why do we think this is important for regulation and governance scholarship? Well, taxation and money laundering are both crimes that transcend intellectual and geographic boundaries, and the analysis and study of them should also reflect this. That's why our analysis of global regulation is important for the regulation and governance scholarship. Furthermore, we also put forward an innovative way to analyze the implementation of regulation in practice through a combination of the analysis of legal texts and surveys to practitioners on the implementation of these legal texts, therefore contributing to regulation and governance to the goal of reporting empirical results, but with broad implications.
Last not least, Peter Gerbrands, me, and Joris Verwede have written a paper on bilateral responsive regulation and international tax competition by making an agent-based simulation model. Peter Gerbrands will present it. Peter, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Brigitte. Our paper studies the effectiveness of international tax policy reforms in the short and the long run. And we do so by using an agent-based model where individual agents with different tax morale, different neighborhoods react to changes in tax policy, and where outcomes are not deterministic but influenced by coincidence. By doing so, we find that adjusting domestic tax policy based on the policy of another country can reduce tax competition and increase compliance. For several countries, we find how they can differentiate their tax policy through an optimal mix of enforcing compliance while providing good quality public services. The fact that a country has to take into account the power that competing countries have to so-called steal tax revenues, we interpret as bilateral responsive regulation. It's important because our paper demonstrates the unintended side effects of regulatory reforms that can happen and provides a theoretical framework to both counter tax competition and increase tax compliance. In addition, it offers a downloadable agent model that helps to find the right policy measures and simulates the associated policy effects.
Thank you, Peter. Well, our special issue makes some policy recommendations which we share or which follow from our papers. The first one is we need international institutions which have to be created at the national and EU level to prevent tax abuse. Second, state responsibilities of taxation, such as drafting tax laws and auditing, should not be left to private actors, but should be done by the state. Third, more transparency is needed. We need better statistics, which should help to identify effective tax rates paid by corporations. Registers of ultimate beneficial ownership should be improved. Tax rulings, tax deduction, tax allowance, this should be made publicly available, regularly be updated and easily accessed. Fourth, policy gaps should be regularly identified, like loopholes, like golden visas and passports. Golden passports should be closed. Real estate owners in tax havens and free port users should become transparent. And fifth, for a democratic and fair worldwide international tax systems, also non-OECD countries should participate in the formulation of policy reforms, and the United States of America should be pushed to reciprocal exchange of information.
We hope that with this special issue, we have shown that studying taxation under a regulation perspective is valuable. And most of all, we hope that it will spark further scholarly debate on a societally very highly relevant topic.